Good evening, everyone. I'm David Selberg, CEO at Hospice of Santa Barbara. We have over 1,000 people participating tonight from all across the United States, as well as internationally. So thank you all for being with us. And a very special thank you to our lead sponsors, the Natalie Orfila Foundation and Lou Buglioli, the Ridley Tree Cancer Center, and the Santa Barbara Foundation. All are sponsoring our entire Illuminate Speakers series. Now I have the pleasure to introduce my friend and colleague at Hospice of Santa Barbara, Charles Caldwell. Charles?
Thanks, David. I'm really looking forward to this conversation tonight with Pico. I think it should be something special for all of us. As many of you know, Hospice of Santa Barbara is a local nonprofit that has been serving families coping with grief or life-threatening illness for the past 47 years. Our motto is compassionate care, freely given. And that reflects that all our services are offered completely free, 100% supported through community donations. During this pandemic, we created the Illuminate Speaker Series as a way to address the widespread anxiety and struggle people were feeling and we were hearing in our work. However, this is only made possible through your support. So if you'd like to help ensure the future of this series, we'd like to ask you to consider please making a gift by visiting our website, and you can find the link in the chat. So David, now back to you.
Thank you so much, Charles. And now I have the honor and the pleasure of introducing our featured Illuminate speaker, Pico Iyer, and moderator, Charles Caldwell. Since 1982, Pico has been a full-time writer, published 15 books, translated into over 23 languages, on subjects ranging from the Dalai Lama to globalism. Some of his books include The Global Soul, The Lady and the Monk, and his best-selling The Open Road, a portrait of the Dalai Lama. Pico's 4 TED Talks have received more than 10 million views so far. A conversation with Pico Iyer will be moderated by Charles Caldwell from Hospice of Santa Barbara. Charles has devoted the last 2 decades to working in nonprofit service. At Pacifica Graduate Institute, he graduated with an MA in Mythological Studies, Depth Psychology. He is inspired by his work at Hospice of Santa Barbara and by his young son, Jack. So without further ado, we present to you a live conversation with Pico and Charles. Charles?
Hi there, Pico. So wonderful to see you again.
Almost exactly a year to the day that we were last speaking. So much has changed and so much hasn't changed. I think one of the wonderful changes has been that Hospice of Santa Barbara has set up this terrific series. And I think the event I did last year was one of the first in the series. And so I must admit, I was feeling rather daunted before coming on today because so many of my heroes and lifelong inspirations have been part of this series. B.J. Miller, Joan Halifax, Daniel Goleman, and all of them have really consecrated their lives entirely to thinking about how to guide us through grief and death and impermanence. So I have much less to say about all of those than they do, but I'm really glad to get the chance to talk to Charles. I remember how last year I was saying that this whole strange season of the pandemic has felt as if we've been airlifted into a foreign country and we don't speak the language, we don't carry the currency, we can't tell what time it is, our maps are no good. It's really been a terrifying time, I think, for all of us. And every time it looks as if there's relief on the horizon, it turns out to be a mirage. And there we are trudging through the desert again without any immediate prospect of relief or water. But as I hope will come out in this conversation, I'm confident that good things can come out of it nonetheless. And I think maybe one thing I will say just at the outset is that the older I get, the more I stop making judgments about which events are good and which events are bad, because I think it's much more mystery to the circumstances of our lives than we can usually unriddle. I remember my young daughter, when she was 13, was diagnosed with stage 3 cancer, almost the worst thing that could happen to any family. But now, 25 years later, I think she would say that she gained at least as much from that experience as she lost, in terms of maturity, in terms of awareness of the world, in terms of empathy. And then I was remembering how when I was 25, suddenly I got the job of a lifetime, a dream job. And later I thought, oh, actually, it's a golden prison. It's so seductive that maybe I would spend the rest of my life there and never wake up to the other possibilities of life. So just one way of saying that when I was much younger, terrible things would happen and wonderful things would happen, and I would call them terrible and wonderful. The more I've lived, the more I decide I don't know which events are good or bad. I just want to work with them as truthfully as I can.
Just to kick us off a little bit, Pico, thinking about this journey that we've been on over the past year and a half, and where so many people have really seemed to try to simply endure the time and to just to cope with it, just to kind of hang in there. But now, as apparently as the pandemic is worsening once again, it seems like we're going to be on this journey for an extended period of time. And it seems the question is kind of arising, is there a way for us to go beyond simply coping and somehow to be transformed by this journey to positive transformation as we go through it? So with this idea, I've been thinking about your career as a travel writer, with all the experience and all the travel that you've done over a lifetime, and travel with all its ups and downs. And I've been thinking about whether there's some lessons from that journey that you've spent over a lifetime that can help shine a light or instruct us through a different lens into this journey that we're currently on through the pandemic. And so just to kick us off, I thought I might share a quote, but just before that, I just wanted to check in with you about that idea of using travel as a lens.
Yes, I mean, I think the heart of travel for me is humbling, in at least two senses. I know you were just last week traveling the Western Sierras with your little son. When the pandemic broke out, I was in Antarctica. And I think when you're surrounded by wonder and beauty and majesty like that, you feel very, very small indeed. Everything falls into perspective. And I think that's a really useful thing. I know when I'm at home, I'm tempted to think I'm a master of the universe. And as soon as I'm out in Antarctica or the mountains, I'm a servant of the universe. I'm a tiny blip in this much larger canvas. And I'm always glad to be reminded of that. And it goes to, I think, what you were saying about the pandemic, which is that the pandemic has really underlined what is always the case. We're never completely in control of our lives. We never know what's going to happen tomorrow. Here, we're in this very comfortable town of Santa Barbara, but we're all prey to forest fires, to earthquakes, to random violence, even in non-pandemic times. Even if you and I were talking in August of 2019, I think deep down we're in the same state of uncertainty, less dramatic than now, and maybe less collective than now, but no less real. The other part of the humbling that I find so useful is that if you travel widely across the globe, you really see how fortunate many of us are. And I think I'm probably like many of my friends. I take living in Santa Barbara very much for granted. And then I go to Haiti or Yemen or Cambodia, and I'm reminded that for 99.9% of the people on the planet, we are living a dream. And I think the season of the pandemic has really been for me the season of taking nothing for granted. Being grateful for what we have, being opened up to everything around us, and being reminded that here you and I are talking again, Charles, 1 year after our last conversation for Hospice, and we're still here. I think most of the people we care for are here. We really have a huge amount to be grateful for. I remember last year when I was talking with Hospice, I spoke a little bit about losing my house in a fire. And of course, that was a terrible shock for hundreds of people around Santa Barbara who lost their homes in that Painted Cave fire. But after I'd adjusted to it, that same year, I was traveling to Tibet and North Korea and Argentina and many other places. And I thought if they were to see me in this very comfortable, affluent, protected Californian town by the ocean, with a roof over my head still, even after losing my house, with relatively good health, without much oppression, with relative peace, never having been hungry, they would say, this guy's had the luckiest life around. And I think whenever I travel, I come back home and just remind myself of the blessings that otherwise I too easily overlook.
That's an interesting idea about gratitude. And it's something I've thought quite a bit over the years about, and a little bit the difference between the actual experience of gratitude versus the shoulds of gratitude. We all hear a lot about we should be grateful, and we know that, and so we try to kind of be grateful. And I've thought about that difference of when I've actually felt that bursting out from inside of gratitude over the safety of somebody or the birth of my son or something along those lines. In that thinking about gratitude, do you have any things to share perhaps about how one might be able to cultivate that deeper expression and experience of gratitude on a regular basis?
Well, I love the distinction you just drew, and you're absolutely right. There are moments in life when suddenly we're released from a predicament or released into a possibility, and that's a moment of a flooding of gratitude. But I like just those quiet, everyday moments. And I think in this pandemic, all of us are so painfully aware of the many, many things it hasn't made possible, it's made impossible. But I've been thinking of the many, many things it's made possible. I got to spend almost every day of the last 15 months with my mother, which never would have been possible otherwise. I've got to spend every hour of the last 15 months with my wife. And usually my job forces me to fly around the world and damage the environment and propel myself into a state of derangement and jet lag fairly regularly. And I think I spoke about this last year, but it's really opened my eyes to the wonder of Santa Barbara. I've been officially based here since I was 7 years old, but I'd never walked around the UCSB lagoon, and I'd never taken daily walks along the beach, and I'd never walked to the end of my mother's road until this year. And it's reminded me, actually, I don't have to travel to the furthest ends of the continent to be transformed or be uplifted. Go down the road, look at my garden with new eyes. And so we're all living in a certain degree of constraint, and it's going on, as you said, much longer than we would like. But I don't think, as you rightly pointed out, that doesn't have to mean that we're in absolute confinement. And I think this is a great chance to find new possibilities in the short term. So every day I think about the things that I'm grateful for. And I know you have my wonderful friend and inspiration, Elizabeth Gilbert, speaking to you next month. And she's one of the beautiful spokesmen for keeping a gratitude journal, for every day reminding herself of the reasons she has to be happy. And the other thing I found with this year is that it's the rare time in my life when I've been allowed to stop and step out of my life and think, where do I really want to go? What's important to me? And how can I craft my life freshly whenever I do go back to some kind of normal? And I think usually we're all speeding down the 101 at 80 miles an hour. And if we have this sense that we're going the wrong way, it's very, very difficult to make a U-turn on a crowded freeway. Really, we have to slow down and stop. And then we can decide whether to go right or left or back the way we were coming. And it's not often in our lives that we have that opportunity, because our lives have been moving so quickly at this post-human space. And I think suddenly this last year, we've been returned to a human pace. And I found it's returned me to humanity. 2 years ago, I spent seven straight months traveling around the world. And I don't think that was a richer experience than the last 7 months I've spent sitting at home. I would say the sitting at home is a much deeper and more intimate kind of experience.
Would you say that whether some of those experiences, both in that 7 months of travel or the 7 months at home, shared any kind of parallels in that? Or what would those parallels maybe be between what many of us might see as this sense of adventure and movement and travel, and the 7 months, have they been completely separate experiences, or are there some nuggets, if you will, between that are shared between those two experiences?
Such a good question. I think travel always is not really about seeing the sights. It's about gaining new eyes. And of course, once you get new eyes, even the old sights look exciting. And that is done as easily by driving to a side of Santa Barbara I've never seen as by going to Tibet. I think what I've learned from my travel is that the destination is much less important than the eyes you bring to it. And we all know this. If you have some very agitated person and he flies to Tibet, he's agitated about Tibet. Nothing has been changed by the fact of his changing location. But that same person may face some kind of drama at home, and suddenly he's jolted out of that agitation and finds something new. So I think, Henry David Thoreau is one of my favorite travelers, and he didn't travel much further than Concord often. And he always said, it matters not how far you go. The further, commonly the worse. What matters is how alive you are. And I think what this last year has shown me is I can be certainly at least as alive in Santa Barbara, discovering new things and rediscovering old things as I would be if I were in Tierra del Fuego tomorrow. It's just a matter of the eyes you choose to bring to it. And I think, I'm pretty sure I did also say this last year, but I feel that at every moment I have a choice whether to turn to what's going to cut me up and make me even more anxious, or what's going to fill me with hope and make me feel liberated. And I think you exercised that choice last week by taking your little boy to the Western Sierras, knowing that he would be opened up and uplifted by that. And so I think travel teaches us that we have much less control over external circumstances than we imagine, that we're always living in this sense of uncertainty. But it also teaches us that we have to make this sense of uncertainty our home, and that in some ways, we have much more control about how we respond to circumstances than we imagine. So you and I, and probably everybody sharing this evening with us, tomorrow when we wake up, we're going to be in this pandemic. But as we go through our day, I think to some degree, maybe a greater degree than we imagine, we can choose. Will I take a walk along the beach? Will I start to garden? Will I look at the street on which I live in Santa Barbara as if I've just arrived here from Cambodia? Or will I follow the news and follow the statistics and get even more agitated about things that fundamentally are outside my control?
It seems that there's a kind of attitude, in a sense, of kind of cultivating the aspect of fresh eyes. So we know that from all of our travel, that when you go to new and unexplored places, one is seeing, very frankly, with new eyes, the sights that we're seeing, the experiences that we have. And as for so many of us who were travel has been truncated during this kind of journey, it seems that perhaps one of the ways through is by cultivating a sense of looking at the everyday or the familiar with a kind of freshness.
Yes, I mean, I know I'm always very happy when my wife can be here in Santa Barbara because she comes from Japan. And whenever somebody from out of town visits, I do all the things I would never do otherwise. I go to the zoo, we walk around the Mission, I try and show them the most beautiful beaches. And by seeing the town I take for granted through the fresh eyes of these deeply appreciative visitors, it really wakes me up in turn to what a treasure I'm living among. And I think, one advantage I have maybe that I try not to take for granted is, as you know, I do spend quite a lot of time in Japan. And when you're in Japan, they have this wonderful phrase that life is a matter of joyful participation in a world of sorrows. So because it's a Buddhist country, they have a very keen sense that every birth ends in death. Every meeting and every conversation like the one we're enjoying now terminates. Impermanence is the currency of life. But the fact that nothing lasts is exactly why everything matters and exactly why we have to cherish it, whether it's the everyday, as you said, or whether it's a once in a lifetime experience. And so from their point of view, suffering isn't the same as unhappiness, that all of us, probably most of us suffer sickness at certain points. If we're lucky, we go through old age. All of us go through death. But unhappiness is just a position we can bring or choose not to bring to that. And that in some ways, appreciating the sense that nothing lasts is exactly what helps us find joy in the moment. The fact that I know I'm only going to get this chance to talk to you online like this for an hour today makes me really want to bring all of my heart and being to this conversation. And I think so with all the encounters of our day. We don't know if they're going to happen tomorrow. So let's really make the most of it. And as you were saying about gratitude, it's the kind of thing it's easy to say and very hard to put into practice. But I found a pandemic actually sharpens our attention and reminds us of what is really important, what we love. And in that way, in my case and that of the people around me, has helped me appreciate things much more than I do when I'm just zipping through my routine and almost sleepwalking through my life.
As you were talking about Japan and a slightly different kind of lens or viewpoint on certain aspects of suffering or death, it made me think of that wonderful idea of the chipped or the cracked teacup. That instead of discarding that which is now broken, but instead that chip or that, and you can correct me with more accuracy, I'm very sure, but that it's highlighted so that it can be even more cherished.
Yes, exactly. I think, mortality is what brings significance to life. If you and I were to live for the next 3,000 years, I don't think we'd bring the same focus, the same intensity, maybe the same care to our interactions with one another or everybody we meet, as we do knowing that, we'll only have 70 or 80 years or however much it might be. And I think one of the things, I've been going to a lot of funerals recently in Japan. And one of the things I've really come to respect there is the way they domesticate death in some ways. In other words, always reminding everybody that, as you were saying with the chipped cup, that death and imperfection is part of life. And so when not so long ago, earlier this year, my wife's uncle died in Kyoto. And when we gathered for the funeral, or the 2 days after his death, his body was right in the center of the room. Our 10-year-old granddaughter was racing around the body and being reminded this is part of what human existence is about. Everybody was having a merry feast and putting out his favorite beer and his favorite kind of ramen right next to his coffin. And then this startled me at first, but after a body is cremated in Japan, all the family members gather around with chopsticks and pick out the bones to put inside an urn. And as I watched my 10-year-old granddaughter do this, I thought, well, this is a really good exercise for not thinking of death as something exotic or abnormal or even abhorrent, but as part of the cycle of existence. And I often think how in my grandparents' day, or certainly in the beginning of the 20th century, I think most people died at home. So little children got used to seeing death around them. Now I believe 70% of people breathe their last breath in hospitals. And so death is ever more remote and I think ever more scary and unsettling. It's always going to be a mystery, but now it's almost like the great unspeakable. And I was very touched to see how in Japan, it's integrated into life. And I think as in many traditional cultures, the sense is that the dead are not gone forever. They've moved to an adjoining room. And in many cases, of course, they're more present in death than they were when they were still alive. Anyone who's been through a breakup romantically knows that suddenly the person you're not going to see again is inside you and around you, and you're hearing her voice all the time. And you're surrounded with her and responsive to her in a way you never were when she was across the room. And in fact, it's appropriate we should be talking about all this now, because this week marks the culmination of the great summer festival of Obon in Japan. And so if you and I were walking down the streets of Kyoto on Sunday, there would be a lantern outside all the graves that overlook the main street, the equivalent to State Street. And people would have lanterns outside their houses, in order for the departed to return to Earth to spend 3 days with their much missed loved ones. And it's believed that they come back at certain points every year, but especially in the middle of August. And people will traditionally take cucumbers and turn them into horses so that their loved ones can come back extra quickly, and then take eggplants and turn them into oxen so they'll return to the heavens very, very slowly. But it's a wonderful reminder that they're as much a part of us as always they were. And we can't put our hands on them, and we can't always see them in the way we could. That doesn't mean they're gone. And I think most of the older cultures in the world have this very rich way of reminding us that the light that was a person is still gleaming all around us and probably inside us.
I know that recently you suffered yourself a loss, the loss of your mom. And when you were with us last time a year ago, you shared about where her condition had worsened and a trip to Cottage Hospital and the beginning of a new chapter, if you will. If you don't mind sharing a little bit.
No, absolutely, especially because all of us are going through variations of this. And I do feel that the most urgent problem before the world right now is climate change. But I think the most urgent problem in the domestic sphere is a kind of human equivalent to climate change, whereby it's almost as if August is visiting in February nowadays, and humans are living longer than we've ever lived before. But that means, just as you said, that we're living for more and more years in a state of pain and confusion and uncertainty. And so, as you remembered so well, my mother had a stroke 6 years ago. And something in me, and maybe something in her, felt that she still had many more years to live and to enjoy. And so even as she was on death's door then, and a doctor told me that she might not live more than a couple of days, her body almost miraculously rallied, and she came back home and got to enjoy 6 more years, thanks to this wonderful physicians we have here in Santa Barbara, and then thanks to the extraordinary caregivers who humbled me every hour with the selflessness and love they brought to this relative stranger. So if she died then, it would have been a terrible shock to me, and I would have felt that's the sadness of a life incomplete. I think she celebrated her 90th birthday in May, and again, I was really prompted to think of all the ways I'm so lucky. If you and I had met when we were in college and you told me your mother's going to live to 90, I'd say, oh, not possible. I wouldn't dare to dream of that. If somebody said to me, at the age of 64, you'll still have a parent living. When I was a kid, I never would have imagined that was a feasible dream either. So again, in so many ways, I feel very, very grateful that, especially as I say, the pandemic allowed my wife and me to spend nearly every day for the last many months with her, including on her final days. And I think one of the conundrums that all of us face now, of course, has to do with care for the elderly. I mean, I'm on my way to being elderly, but in the meantime, looking after the elders. And it's an emotional predicament that none of us is really equipped to handle, because of course, if you try to look after an aging spouse or sibling or parent, often both parties get very afraid. But if you don't try to look after them, you feel guilty. And if a part of you is wishing for their release, a part of you is also thinking, are you just wishing for your own release? And so it takes us into all these very difficult emotional places. But I think most of all for me, it was just a reminder of how close we're living all the time with mystery. And you and I were talking earlier this evening about living with uncertainty, but the higher form of uncertainty is mystery. And as I watched my mother in her later years, I didn't know how much she could understand, but I think probably much more than I imagined. And I think at some level, intuition was taking in all kinds of things, even if the rational mind was not. And so there was a mystery of consciousness in our later years, and the mystery of her suddenly getting a stroke that almost took her life, and then surviving that, and then the mystery of suffering another stroke 6 years on, which did take her life. And so again, for me, it's a kind of training in bowing before the world and reminding myself how little I know what's going on and what's going to happen. And I think you mentioned this earlier, that for me, the pandemic has really been a crash course in three things. Maybe in humility, which is where I began with travel. I'm not in control of my itinerary. I can't tell you what I'm going to be doing 3 months from now, as I pretended I could. I've been freed from the illusion of control. It's been a training in patience, because we're waiting and waiting and waiting for it to pass. And we've been waiting far longer than we expected. And I think it's a training in gratitude. Every moment I could think about what's frustrating about it, but I could also think about what's liberating about it. And had I been on the far side of the world, as I probably would have been otherwise, when my mother breathed her last, there would have been a lifetime of if onlys and what ifs. So I thank lockdown for that small blessing.
It's a little bit kind of returning to that notion of how do we kind of transform our experience. And certainly the lessons of our work at Hospice of Santa Barbara is this almost paradoxical journey, that it is certainly a journey of grief and sorrow, but it is also a journey of life and hope, and at times laughter in the face of that. And almost in parallel to yours, I lost my mother some years back, and she had had a stroke 6 years before that, and then managed to live for another 6 years before she passed. And that journey was such a complex time that we got to kind of spend together. And it makes me kind of think of the parallels, in a sense, with this journey that the world is on right now, where on one hand, there's all this sorrow and grief and tragedy. And on the other hand, people are exploring new ways of being in their own lives. They're, as we've all read, many people are quitting their jobs to find a new passion in life, a new direction. People have been going out into nature and camping in droves, exploring different things. And it seems like there's this kind of paradoxical journey a little bit, and that there's lessons from that journey around death that can be applied to the paradoxical nature that we find ourselves in.
Oh, I love that. Yes, I mean, for me, it's really a reminder that life can't be reduced to simplicities. And just as you were saying, 5 minutes before her death, my mother was watching Jeopardy with me and my wife, and she was as happy as I've ever seen her. And years earlier, when she'd been very healthy, she was very unhappy. So we're very keen to reduce things into grief versus joy. But as you said, they both move in mysterious ways, and the relation between them is mysterious. And I was very happy that you invoked the presence of hope too. I've always remembered one of the great philosopher kings of my lifetime, Václav Havel, who became president of the Czech Republic after being a playwright for so long. He said that hope isn't the conviction that everything will turn out right, because it doesn't always. But it's just the confidence that there's a meaning and an order to things, even if it's one that we can't apprehend, that the universe makes sense. And if the universe does make sense, it's probably not a sense that you and I, who are these little blips, can formulate or begin to articulate. But as long as we feel that there's a logic and a love at work in the world, then it's much harder to be despairing. So I've never been one for waiting for the Hollywood happy ending, but that doesn't mean that there's an unhappy ending, that life nearly always takes place in somewhere between the dramatic extremes.
Yeah, that notion of hope during times which, for I think each and every one of us at times, feels rather dark and a little forbidding, even as we look towards the future, that there seems to be an energy or a power to that idea of holding on to, as you were sharing, to the idea of hope, that there's, with that order, that sense that there is direction or perhaps destiny, that it might be kind of a beacon, in a sense, that helps us to navigate through the darkness of our current circumstance.
Yes, and when you say navigate, we're all in the same boat, literally. I mean, suffering is an equal opportunity employer, and I think it's always iconic to remember that we're side by side in this boat, and the hope is always that it would cut through certain enmities or ideological divisions. I never forget, David was mentioning at the beginning how I'm lucky enough to spend a lot of time with the Dalai Lama, and I remember, I don't think I mentioned this last year, but right after the Japanese tsunami, I traveled up with him to this fishing village that had been laid waste by the tsunami. 3,000 people had been killed, nearly all the buildings had been swept away. And when we pulled up at the one temple that survived, lots and lots of people were gathered along the side of the road, mostly women. They were weeping, and the Dalai Lama went out and he blessed them, and he held them, and he gave what comfort he could, and he told them, don't think of the past, which you can't change, think of the future, which you can affect every moment. When you're thinking about the ones you've lost, honor them by doing the things that they would like to see completed. Rebuild your community just the way Japan so miraculously did at the end of the Second World War. And so he gave them all these inspiring words. And then when he turned around, because I was standing right next to him, I could see there was a tear in his eye. In other words, the wisdom doesn't take away from the grief. He was still human enough to feel what all these people were feeling, absolutely bereft. But at the same time, the grief didn't get in the way of the clarity. And then he went into this little temple and he started addressing the handful of people who had survived. And he said, I can't begin to imagine what you've been through. But I remember myself, he said, when I was 24 and I was in my home in Lhasa, and I was told I had to leave my country that night, or else the country would be destroyed and I would be destroyed. I didn't have time to say goodbye to my friends. I couldn't pick up my dog. I didn't have time to do anything. I just had to take flight. And when I got to the border 2 weeks later, I found that most of my friends were gone. And for me, among other things, it was a reminder that the Dalai Lama, who many people regard as one of the wise beacons, in your word, of the world, he's lived as a refugee for 61 years now, 62 years. He's never got to see the 6 million people he was born to rule. He's a refugee living in very, very difficult circumstances without a passport. And yet, as he was saying all this to the people, he was radiating his usual strength and warmth and confidence. And so all the suffering he had been through had not begun to diminish his conviction that ultimately things change, surprises come as quickly as tragedies, and that we can't assume that we can ever second guess life. And I think with somebody like that, it's his example as much as his words that speak. And most people, when they look at the Dalai Lama, or I think often Pope Francis too, what they see is joy and calm and smiles. People in very, very difficult lives. I remember Pope Francis, I think, saying that when he prays, when he's addressing a problem, he's not praying for an answer to the problem. He's just praying that he'll be able to live with that problem, which may be insoluble. He's praying for that strength. And I think that's a very good lesson too. Whenever I listen to Pope Francis, the main thing I get from him is humility as well as wisdom and kindness. And so when we turn to a lot of the beacons in the world, none of them is denying that difficulty is part of the equation, but none of them is ever denying hope, confidence, and clarity.
Mm-hmm. I think that's a wonderful couple of stories for us to kind of transition to taking some questions from our audience tonight. Both that the story with the Dalai Lama and Pope Francis, I think really offer that sense that we are living with multiple kind of realities, both outside of us and inside of us, and that we don't have to deny one to choose a different path forward. So I'm going to open up the chat feature as we begin to get some questions and take some for you, Pico, from what people have to share. So I have one that is actually in the Q&A from Brian that asks, what is the most persuasive encouragement that we can offer from a humanistic perspective?
or dare I say, this too shall pass. And I think when we talk about grief and joy being interchangeable, it often strikes me that when I'm in a really happy moment, there's always that pang of wistfulness because I know it can't last forever. But conversely, when I'm in a very, very difficult moment, there's always that glint of light because I know that's not going to last forever. And among other things, what this last year has reminded us is things are changing constantly and unpredictably every moment. And I suppose that's why more and more of us try to root ourselves in whatever we imagine.
Another question from Ian, and he asks, how do you see the unique role of a writing practice in your life that other experiences or forms of expression, how might they operate or offer in the same way between writing and other forms of expression?
Well, thank you so much, Ian, because I suppose writing is my ultimate guilty pleasure. And it's also my livelihood, my living and my love. So I'm really lucky in that regard. But I'm most lucky in the sense that every day when I wake up, pretty much without exception, I go to my desk for 5 hours. And much of the time, nothing really comes out of my sitting at my desk in those 5 hours. But I have this rare luxury of being able to step out of the tumult. It's like walking into a quiet cabin in the woods, gathering myself, preparing myself for what's to come, trying to put into perspective everything that I've encountered, whether it's my most recent conversation with my wife or the death of my mother, and allowing me a chance just to take a deep breath so as to come back into the world with more direction. And so that happens to be my practice. I've never meditated or done yoga or any kind of mindfulness, but I think writing allows me to sit still for 5 hours a day, which is a great blessing. But for those people who do yoga or take a run or play music or sketch or practice, play the piano or cook, I think each of us has our own forms of decompressing and steadying ourselves through this world of change with a rite that or a practice that seems relatively changeless. And so in that sense, writing is kind of my sanctuary and my monastery that I can return to every day through thick and thin. And the other beauty of writing is that it does remind you that you're not powerless. And when something very difficult happens, you have a voice. You can speak back to the world. You can share what you've been through with other people. And I find a great blessing when I travel, and I'm often in war zones or places of great difficulty, and I'm hesitant about wanting to write about what I'm seeing, but nearly always the people in Tibet or El Salvador or Yemen will say to me, please, 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 take our stories back into the world. Otherwise, we're going through this difficulty and nothing good comes of it. But if people in the United States know what's happening in Afghanistan or Iraq or wherever it happens to be, we're not alone. And maybe our suffering isn't entirely in vain. So I'm very grateful for what writing can give me in that regard too. But again, somebody taking photographs, someone taking sketches, of course, a humanitarian is enjoying the same benefits in different forms.
It seems that sense of kind of positive action seems related to a question that somebody had asked, where he asked, how do you build the hope and positive attitude in these challenging times? And do you feel like there's a connection between that kind of positive action towards that, or?
Charles, you've answered it perfectly. I couldn't do better. I mean, I love the fact that you use the word action. And I often notice sometimes I wake up at 3 in the morning and I lie in bed in the dark. The world seems impossible. All I think of is, all the challenges that face me and the myriad uncertainties in my life, and one after another piling up. And I think, how can I begin to get through my day? But as soon as I get up and I start moving through my day, just getting my shower, having my breakfast, I'm moving forward. I'm beginning to take care of that seemingly bottomless list of challenges. As soon as I'm in action, I'm not in my head. And I think that's part of the beauty of travel. To go back to your very first question, it releases us from the prison of our head and into the bounty of the world and the vastness of the world and this huge canvas, which is always going to be much more inspiring than the small gerbil wheel in my head that's ticking over and thinking about how will I be able to pay for the caregivers for the next 3 months or whatever it might be. And usually my thoughts like that or my worries are based on things that aren't going to happen anyway. Almost nothing bad that's happened to me has ever been anything I've expected. And whenever I'm anticipating something terrible, it's never happened either. So I feel the mind is a very limiting function, but action is a very liberating one. And it's interesting, the Dalai Lama, of course, he comes from a different tradition from Pope Francis, but he always says, don't pray for peace, just do something. Don't pray that the world's going to get better, because from his tradition, action is everything.
Yeah, yeah. I have an additional question from Sarah, which says, what about the aspect of anger as it relates to grief? How do you work at controlling that part of the grief process?
I think part of it is to acknowledge that both of those are inevitable, that when we lose somebody, we're angry. We're angry at the universe. We're angry at God. We're angry at fate, however you want to phrase it. And there's going to be some target. I remember I once watched a woman who had just lost her husband, and she went to her room and just tore off her bracelets and threw them across the room in rage. And of course, she's outraged that suddenly her life has been changed in an instant for the worse. So I think don't fight against the anger, don't fight against the grief. Those are all natural responses, universal responses. We're all in the same boat too. In a larger context, though, I think also don't take them too seriously, or don't treat them to be something much greater than they are. I know in a non-grief context, in everyday life, when I'm angry at somebody or something, it's nearly always anger at myself. And I think the Dalai Lama often cites 90% of anger, according to scientific tests, as projection. So I'm angry because somebody has ripped me off. Actually, I'm really angry that I misplaced my trust, or wasn't discerning enough, or allowed myself to be taken advantage of. Nearly always the problem is with me. And when I think of that, that makes a lot of the everyday anger I might feel seem rather silly. But I think the anger that comes from grief is part of the grief, and there's probably nothing worse than stifling it.
Yeah, it's such a complex journey, and one of my favorite pieces that I've kind of been educated in my work with the staff here at Hospice Santa Barbara is about that grief journey, and that it's not a simple movement through particular discrete change steps in the journey, but rather it's a whole kind of confused backwards and forwards and up and down and all over the place journey that can't be confined or defined that well.
Yeah, well, you're reminding me, I almost wish I were asking these questions of you, because you have so much experience with this, and I would love to hear your answers to those questions. But I mean, that's a perfect reformulation of I think what I was saying, just about how things can't be reduced into this thing or that thing. And I love that story of how when you're in a rowboat and on a lake, and suddenly another boat hits yours, and you get up and you start shouting, how dare you, why don't you look where you're going, you spoiled my afternoon. And then you see there's nobody in the boat, and you realize, why am I getting angry? So it's, whether there's somebody in the boat or whether there's not, it's exactly the same event. But as long as we assume somebody's responsible, we start projecting anger and thinking it's a good idea to release it. And as long as we see the boat is empty, we think, oh, why are we destroying our own afternoon by an anger that's not going to help us or the loved ones who are sharing the boat with us?
Yeah. We have a question from Ken, which said, how has your experience with your own recent losses impact how you look at and approach your own aging?
It's a really, really good question. Of course, it's the question I've been asking myself these last 6.5 years. And it's a very cautionary tale, I think, because good odds that I will be in a very diminished state. It may be very difficult to the people that I love, and may be very difficult to strangers too. What can I do now to guard against that? And I know one of your wonderful guests is, you've hosted, is Frank Osaseki, who always refers to death as the secret teacher. And I think maybe the one thing I started thinking about quite a few years ago is that death is a bit like a final exam. And we prepare so much for our test at the DMV or a job interview or even our first dates, but we don't prepare for what is the one unavoidable universal test that's coming to us all. And I always feel, well, death's not going to go away just if I don't think about it. So maybe the privilege of witnessing a death of a loved one close up is being forced to address just the question that Ken posed. How can I begin to prepare myself now so that maybe I will be less of a burden to people than I might otherwise be when I'm not myself, as I see it, when my body is broken and maybe my mind is broken too. And I'm not confident that I would be able really to prepare myself or to be in control of myself there. But I figure any conscious thought in that direction is a good thing. And I remember in the case of my mother, she was a professor of philosophy and world religions for 50 years. And I think she spent a lot of good time thinking about it. And I remember 20 years before her death, she was taking precautions and telling me, if I die, this is what you should do. And I think very wisely turning her eye towards that which we would usually much rather not look at.
Mm-hmm. Speaking of your mom briefly, I so appreciated the eloquent memorial piece that you had written for your mom in our local independent newspaper. And I was really moved deeply by just what an amazing and passionate life that she had lived. And I was wondering if you could cast yourself in her shoes to offer something to the people who are listening today as we go through this journey that we're all facing through the pandemic and personal and collective grief and struggle. What would your mom share?
Oh, such a really beautiful question. Thank you, Charles. When I think of my mother, I think she went through World War II. She went through sudden displacement to England when she was a student. She went through a second sudden migration to California. She went through the burning down of her house and her loss of everything she owned in the world when she was 59. She went through the death of her husband and then subsequently the death of most of those close to her. And there she was laughing and watching Jeopardy 5 minutes before her death. And I think that's my experience with most of the people I know. And again, during this pandemic, I've sometimes thought of my father-in-law from Japan. And again, just to sort of put myself in perspective, when I'm feeling sorry for myself. I remember the age of 19, he was enlisted in the army. He fought for 5 years in Manchuria. The reward for that was spending 2 years in a prisoner of war camp in Siberia. When finally he was able to return in 1947 to his hometown of Hiroshima, it was to find it had been completely devastated by the atomic bomb and members of his family were suffering from radiation. And he lived a relatively happy, full life till the age of 91. And I think if I'd talked to him on the last day of his life and said, have you had a happy life or not? He would have said, oh yeah, I've had a good, rich, happy life, full of its share of challenges, of course. And when I think of his instance, I also think, I've been so blessed never really to be through war in my lifetime in an immediate way, never to have had to be enlisted in an army or be a prisoner of war. And I just find that when things are looking very difficult in my own little life, I try to pan out and see things in this larger perspective, and then it changes. I just, a couple of weeks ago, came across this wonderful quote from D.H. Lawrence, who said, "Death is not sad if you've truly lived." And D.H. Lawrence died at the age of 44, but by the age of 44, he'd published 78 books, he'd traveled around the world, he'd lived as deep and intense a life as anyone I'm aware of. And I think that's the lesson that death has to teach for those of us who are still living. Embrace our lives right now. We don't know how long they're going to last, but we have the rare privilege of a life. Let's make the most of it.
Mm-hmm. Well, we're just about at the end of our time. It's, of course, moved so incredibly fast, and I personally, of course, could sit and enjoy talking and sharing with you. And we really just have like one last minute. And there's a final question that was a perfect kind of summation, I thought. This is from Abby. And just briefly, if you could. And she says, if you had one suggestion, one piece of information that you feel is important to impart, what would that be? One essential. I know that's very difficult, but.
I would say take a walk.
Okay.
Not a long or complex answer, but especially if you're living in Santa Barbara, tomorrow take a walk.
Okay. I think that is a wonderful piece of positive action, as we've talked about, that, as we know, as we have a saying in my house, you never know what's going to happen when you leave your front door. And as we go on this journey, we just like to thank you for offering the insights and reflections about from your own life, but also how we all might go on this journey together.
Thank you, Charles.
Yeah. With that, David, I'll turn it back over to you. Thank you, Pico.
Thank you so much, Pico and Charles. This was an intimate, warm, simply warm conversation for us to hear. Thank you so much for that. We're deeply grateful. And I say to all of our wonderful participants tonight that we're so pleased to be able to offer the Illuminate series free, but we couldn't do it without your help. So please consider a donation to help ensure the future of this series in 2022 by using one of the methods shown here on the screen. And also, I'd like to mention that we have Elizabeth Gilbert, who's the author of Eat, Pray, Love, as our keynote speaker at our Heroes of Hospice event, which is our annual fundraiser every year. So for more information on that and to purchase tickets, please visit our website, hospiceofsb.org. And thank you for considering that. And have a good rest of your day and evening. And thank you all for being with us.